Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend the fanfic friend with fanfiction. This is What if Deku had only one joint in his pinky toe? Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into it. The fanfic. Izuku swung his feet idly in his chair as the doctor hemmed and peered at his medical chart. The man coughed, adjusted his glasses, and ruffled a few papers before speaking. Well, it is of course possible that young Mr. Midoriya possesses a quirk that is yet to manifest, allowed Dr. Yamada. The longer it goes without showing a sign, though, the worse chance he's got. According to the bell curve, the probability of developing a quirk after age 8 is less than 5%. Mom looked flustered. Buta broken bar at the appointment 4 years ago. Used to broken bar the x-rays of his foot. He doesn't have the extra pinky bone, so that means he has a quirk. Izuku perked up and stared down at his feet proudly. His toes hadn't let him down yet. It's not quite that simple, hedged the doctor. As you know, 20% of the population is quirkless. Well, a further 10% of quirkless individuals still lack the extraneous bone. That means that although it's rare, 2% of all humans are both quirkless and single-jointed. Although it's considered impossible to have the extra joint and also have a quirk, not having it doesn't guarantee you one. The young boy deflated a bit, but didn't say anything. His mom and the doctor had this conversation every year at his annual checkup, and every year, the probability of Izuku having a quirk just went down and down and down. In some ways, he would have preferred to just have the pinky bone and be done with it. At least then he wouldn't have to deal with this long, drawn-out agony of wondering, do I or don't I? Is it possible though that Izuku has a quirk, but it's just a broken bar, really subtle, something that we haven't noticed yet? Dr. Yamada hummed. You can pull small objects towards yourself, and your husband breathed fire, correct? Generally speaking, there's close to a 50-50 chance that Izuku would inherit one of those talents, or a combination thereof. Mutations do occur, of course, but most of the time they're at least tangentially related. Perhaps he might push objects away from him or manipulate fire another way. The further you get from the original quirk, the less likely it gets. Perhaps there's a 10% chance he'd breathe ice instead of fire, or a 1% chance he could breathe underwater, etc. Breathing underwater would be really useful for ocean rescues, or floods. Izuku piped up. I met Aqualady at a convention once. She can hold her breath for 3.5 hours and also has a set of swimming lungs she uses to adjust her internal buoyancy to help her sink or float. She doesn't talk about it a lot, but she can also use them to deal with altitude sickness. Izuku had actually guessed that last part. He hadn't thought about it until he saw her. But once he did, the idea just seemed to click in his head. When he asked her, she seemed surprised but acknowledged that she'd never felt ill, even in Japan's tallest mountains. For some reason, Dr. Yamada paused and looked at him carefully. You a broken bar, you really know a lot about quirks, don't you? The man exchanged a glance with his mother. Oh, Izuku was used to pity. It was just too ironic that the quirkless boy knew more about quirks than anyone else in his class. There was an awkward silence. Well, Yamada began cautiously. There's still hope he a broken bar, but if you haven't manifested any abilities by the time you start middle school, the chances are, well, 0.1%. And the odds that your quirk is completely unrelated to your parents, enough to be unnoticeably broken bar, it's almost negligible. Negligible, but not 0.1% of people manifest their quirk in middle school, you know. It sounds really low, but 0.1% of 10 billion is 10 million. That's a lot of people who don't see their quirk until my age. Shut up, Deku, commanded Kaken imperiously. I don't need you to do math for me. Get back to your homework. Ah, sorry Kaken, I didn't mean to distract you, I got distracted myself. Problem 14b reminded me of that statistic though. It's just, zip it, Deku, Kaken said. No one wants to hear you start muttering. By no one, Kaken meant himself, since he and Izuku were the only ones in Kaken's room. The two boys sat cross-legged on the floor, homework spread out in front of them. He and Kaken had a complicated relationship. Even though the blonde snapped at him and called him Deku, he was still probably Kaken's closest friend. The thing was, Kaken was really proud and ambitious, which led him to judge people either as challengers or beneath him. Thus far everyone fell into the second category, except for Izuku. Kaken was smart enough to know that even though the chance of him developing a quirk was small, it was still a non-zero number. Therefore Izuku was stuck in an odd in-between zone, since Kaken wouldn't dismiss him as totally useless until they were sure he wouldn't end up with an awesome quirk. That meant that oddly enough, quirkless Izuku was the only person Kaken judged on their merits rather than their potential to beat Kaken in a fight. And since they often vied for the number 1 and 2 spots in their class academically, one day Kaken had imperiously declared that he and Izuku were going to do homework together, not that I need your help. And that was that. Plus there was that time. Pay attention, deku. Kaken raised a bare foot and kicked out towards him. A small explosion snapped off in his direction, startling him but not so much as scorching his hair. Izuku yelped and windmilled his arms as he fell backwards. He shielded his face, not to protect himself but rather to hide his grin. He knew that he didn't have anything to fear from his friend. If Kaken had actually been trying to hurt him, the other boy would have used his hands. The blonde couldn't get a decent-sized blast from the soles of his feet yet. Izuku had been the one to figure out that Kaken even had the potential to do that. It had been a guess, just intuition, but something in him told Izuku that Kaken might have secondary nitroglycerin sebaceous glands in his feet in addition to his palms. Kaken had scowled and teased him for being a stupid deku, but a week later came to school in flip-flops and showed off his new skill. Kaken had vehemently denied that Izuku's suggestion had anything to do with the development, but after that he'd been a little bit more willing to listen when Izuku had something to say. "Ugh, if you're not going to pay attention you should just go home," complained Kaken. Izuku rolled over, hopped to his feet and started collecting his things, ignoring the disappointment that flickered on Kaken's face for a moment. He knew that the other boy would just be mad if he realized that Izuku had noticed it. "I have to get home for dinner. Anyways," Izuku said brightly, "thanks for doing homework with me, Kaken." "Whatever, deku," scoffed the blonde, but the quirk of his lips betrayed him. Kaken was definitely a grumpy person, but he wasn't nearly as aloof as he liked to pretend. "See you after the holiday. Maybe my quirk will have showed up by the time you get back," Izuku chirped hopefully. He ignored Kaken's less than optimistic response. Even if it was just a 0.1% chance, he was still holding out for a really awesome quirk. It was kind of ironic that Kaken had more faith in Izuku's potential to become a hero than All Might did. Their friendship had become strained recently, since Izuku's decision to apply to UUI's heroics department was announced. He was still in that gray area between rival and bug beneath my feet in Kaken's mind, but technically applying to UUI would put the two of them in direct competition, and also threaten the blonde's dream of being the only person to get into the course from their shitty state-funded middle school. Kaken wasn't outright cruel, but he was angry, and felt like Izuku was being selfish for acting against his dream. Izuku admired Kaken more than anyone else except for All Might, but he was still peeved enough at the hypocrisy that they weren't really on speaking terms. Even so, broken bar the fact that the blonde boy even considered it a possibility ranked his faith in Izuku higher than All Might's. The number 1 hero had been entirely unambiguous in telling him that he had no hope. In fact, Izuku was so dejected that he nearly missed the commotion entirely. Still, it was habit for him to watch villainous encounters, and he was deeply curious about what kind of quirks might be on display. As if he weren't already feeling terrible enough, the dawning realization that his utter incompetence and bullheadedness had caused the villain that All Might had captured to get free felt even worse. It was like he'd swallowed a ball of lead. God, he was so pathetic and stupid and quirkless. He was an idiot for ever thinking that he could become a hero, and an even bigger idiot for thinking that he was going to wake up one day with a quirk despite the astronomically low odds, and an even bigger idiot for being so desperate to be reassured by his hero that he caused a dangerous villain to get free. Some innocent person was going through agony right now because of him. That was the least heroic thing anyone could ever do. Kaken was right to discourage him from becoming a hero. Kaken was the one being suffocated by the green liquid monster. Looking at them, Izuku suddenly knew what was going to happen. The villain's body was fluid. He would fill up Kaken's lungs and squeeze himself into the empty spaces in Kaken's body, and wear Kaken like a suit. The heroes would be too afraid of hurting the boy to attack the villain, but by that point it would be too late. The villain's quirk didn't keep its victims alive. Kaken would have suffocated and died long before the monster stopped using his body as a puppet. And it would all happen while he was surrounded by heroes, by people who were doing nothing. Izuku didn't understand why he was so sure, nor did he understand exactly when he made the decision to intervene. Before he even had the chance to finish his thoughts, he'd already cleared the last bystander and passed the idle heroes. There wasn't a thought, or even a decision as he'd previously assumed. Izuku was used to analyzing, measuring, comparing. Sometimes it felt like he couldn't even decide on what cereal to eat in the morning without a bar chart and a mutter storm. Nevertheless, this time his body just moved on its own, and it was too late to back out. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. Boot to broken bar the eyes. Izuku whirled around and tossed his backpack at the villain's eye, and was rewarded by seeing it flinch. It pulled back enough for Kaken to gasp for breath. "What the hell are you doing, Deku?" screamed Kaken. "I don't know." "I don't." His eyes met Kaken's. I couldn't watch you die." He almost started grasping at the sludge surrounding his friend, but an instinct told him that it would be futile. The villain's eyes had reared back, but Izuku's gaze caught on the mouth, which was off to the right of Kaken. Before he could think about it, Izuku swung his leg towards it as hard as he could. "Grah!" The slime monster screamed and flinched back even further, freeing one of Kaken's hands. Izuku grabbed it and pulled as hard as he could, with his entire body weight. Kaken's upper body fell out of the villain's grasp, and the blonde immediately turned around and started blasting at it. "Die! Die! Die! Die!" Kaken screamed. Izuku leapt to his feet and braced Kaken's shoulders and back. "Your feet! Blast them out!" The two of them shot backwards when Kaken directed the full force of both his hands and feet towards the villain. Izuku braced himself to hit the pavement, but impact never came. Instead he was caught by a broken bar. "All Might, never fear, for I am here," laughed the hero. Izuku worried about the man's health, but after that it was over almost instantly. In no time, he and Kaken were sitting under rescue blankets, watching the remains of the villain be collected. It was surreal to think that 10 minutes ago he'd been fighting for their lives. Kaken seemed to be in a daze as well. Although the blonde was getting heaped with praise for his incredible work, he didn't look Izuku's way even once. "Wow, kid." Mount. Lady grinned. "That was really impressive." Izuku looked to his left, and then his right. "Oh, was she talking to me?" he squeaked. Mount. Lady laughed. "Yes, you. Do you have a foresight quirk or something?" "Oh." Izuku flushed. Actually a broken bar. I was just doing what felt right. I don't have a quirk." Mount. Lady's expression changed faster than the hero ingenium could run. "What? Quirkless?" she shrieked. Izuku flinched. That had caught everyone's attention. "Do you have any idea how reckless you were? How lucky you got? If your friend hadn't had such an incredible quirk, a broken bar." What followed was the most thorough rearing out that Izuku had ever received. Each hero there, with the exception of All Might, seemed to take turns telling him just how idiotic and lucky he'd been. Izuku burned with indignation. After all, he'd been the one to actually free Kaken, while they all stood around watching him die. Nevertheless, he knew that they were right. If one single thing had been different, like if his book bag had missed, or if the villain's mouth had been too high to kick it, then he would have died immediately. Even though it had worked, it just reinforced how dumb he'd been. Yeah, maybe he could help beat one villain, but a hero couldn't keep relying on luck like that. Without the quirk, Izuku couldn't face the kinds of villains that heroes fought every day. And it was time to admit it. He was quirkless. All he'd done was make everyone mad at him. Even Kaken was furious, storming up to him after the fact to tell him off. "You idiot, Deku." "I was fine," snarled Kaken. "I didn't need your help. You don't a broken bar. You don't get to die trying to save me, okay?" Kaken was as close to crying as Izuku had ever seen him. "I'm the hero." "Damn it, Deku." "You could've." Kaken cut himself off, shoving Izuku away from him. The blonde spun around and skulked away before Izuku could even respond. What? Had Kaken been a broken bar worried about him? Before he could fully process that revelation, All Might jumped out in front of him. Their conversation was surreal, capping off an already unbelievable day. Nevertheless, for the rest of his life, there was one sentence that he'd never forget. "Young man," All Might said, "you, too, can be a hero." After that, Izuku and Kaken's friendship was strained. Once Kaken finally accepted that Izuku was going to apply to Yui regardless of what he demanded, they stopped speaking altogether. Izuku wished that he could do something to fix things, but quite frankly he was too busy with All Might's training regimen. In every bit of spare time he had, including during school, Izuku was working to strengthen some part of his body. Therefore, he was doing his best to enjoy the brief respite the hero was giving him. Izuku lay flat on his back in a clearing in the rubble at Dagobah Park, panting as he caught his breath. They were done for the day, but All Might wanted to pause and work on his flexibility. It was convenient, because Izuku had been trying to work up the nerve to ask the man a question for a couple of weeks now. The blonde man looked at him. "Yes, my boy." Izuku immediately averted his gaze, finding the sand beneath him extremely interesting. "Oh, and never mind." There was a pause. "You know," mused All Might, "a hero should never back down out of fear." "No." His green curls bounced as his head snapped back up. "I mean a broken bar. It's not that I'm afraid." Exactly. It's just kind of rude." "Well, go on." All Might encouraged him. "I doubt you'd say anything truly rude, so it can't be that bad." Izuku blushed. It's just that." He took a breath. "One for all is a stockpiling quirk." Izuku immediately ducked his head and tried not to tremble. The silence lasted long enough that he dared to peek through his fringe. All Might was gaping at him. You mean I'm right?" squeaked Izuku. He'd known he was right. He had an excellent intuition for quirks. Still, the secret about All Might's quirk was one of the greatest mysteries of modern heroics. Finally, the man spoke. "What makes you think that?" All Might's encouraging tone made him feel a bit braver, so Izuku raised his head again to meet his mentor's eyes. "Well," Izuku began tentatively, "it's just that a broken bar. Everyone says you can't have a stockpiling quirk, because you don't show any of the weaknesses of one. A stockpile broken bar, well, it runs out, and your energy never does. But they don't know what I do." Izuku was on a roll now. He was a hero fanboy of epic proportions, and he rarely had an audience as intent as All Might was now. "You said that One for All was passed down from user to user, getting stronger and stronger. I mean, a stockpile is just a bank of energy, basically, so it always runs out, even if it's got a multiplier or an interest rate. Heroes can't afford to hold back often, and the way you throw around super-powered punches left and right should exhaust a stockpile pretty quickly. A broken bar unless you've hit the critical threshold." "The critical threshold?" All Might questioned. Izuku had a feeling it was rhetorical, but he was too excited to hold back. "Yeah, it's like a broken bar. The stockpile is a bank, and like any bank it has an interest rate. If you've got 100 energy dollars, and a 0.1% daily interest rate, then you wake up with $100.1. It doesn't sound too impressive, but if you've got $1 million, then you get $100 every day. The critical threshold is when you have some withdrawal limit. If your withdrawal limit is $100 a day, then the bank account is functionally infinite. Your account never loses money, and that's what's so sneaky about One for All. A normal person with a stockpile quirk is limited by the amount of energy they have in their stockpile, not the amount that they can take out. But the whole reason we're training like this is to prepare my body to handle the quirk. That means there's more energy in One for All than I could possibly use. A broken bar, maybe even more than you could possibly use. That's why your strength seems infinite. The previous wielders put so much energy into the stockpile that your withdrawal limit of the amount of energy your body can handle never exceeds the interest rate. Plus, All Might was an enigma. He was singular. If there had been a whole line of people just like him, everyone would know. Instead, he was a hero that just appeared one day and changed the whole world. It didn't make any sense unless All Might himself reached the critical limit. One for All would have been powerful before hitting the critical threshold, but nothing like the unlimited energy source it became afterwards. He was distracted from his thoughts. Had he been muttering? By All Might's booming laugh. "Young Madrya, I constantly find myself surprised by you. Your perceptiveness is an incredible pleasure. Izuku's blushed, but it was quickly tempered when All Might's gaze turned solemn. I planned on waiting to tell you this, but since you've guessed so much of it already, a broken bar. You see, long ago, when quirks first graced this world, there was an incredibly powerful, yet incredibly terrible man. He had the ability to take away others' quirks, and bestow them upon those he deemed worthy. We do not know why, or whether it was an act of kindness or a bribe, but the man decided to give his quirkless brother a simple stockpiling ability. What he had no way of knowing, however, was that the brother was not in fact quirkless. He just had an ability that was subtle, and would never have shown itself otherwise, the ability to pass his own genetics off to others. His native quirk merged with the one gifted to him, and One for All was born. Izuku pondered what he'd been told. It made sense. More than that, though, it just felt right. All Might? Yes, young Midoriya. Do you a broken bar? Do you think maybe I'm like the brother? I don't have the pinky bone that quirkless people have. What if I had a quirk and never knew it? All Might hummed, considering the question. I think, my boy, that it doesn't matter. I didn't choose you as my successor for any skills or attributes you may or may not have. I chose you because you have the spirit of a true hero. It makes no difference to me whether or not you have a quirk, subtle as it may be. All that matters to me is in here. Izuku stumbled backwards as All Might tapped him on the chest, over his heart. He worried his lower lip, trying to suppress both his smile and the tears that threatened to spill. No one had ever told him that he mattered, that there was something intrinsic to him that mattered more than any quirk. All his life, it had just been a challenge to be seen beyond his lack of a quirk, but All Might, his greatest hero, had done so, and had seen something in him so admirable that he wanted to make Izuku his successor. It was almost overwhelming. I swear, All Might, a broken bar, I won't let you down. I'll work harder, twice as hard, until I'm worthy of One for All, and then I'll be the best hero ever. All Might smiled at him, but it was different from the grin Izuku had seen countless times on the TV. Those other smiles didn't look half as proud. Of that, my boy, I have no doubt. His days passed in a haze of sweat and hard work, and before he knew it, Izuku was standing in a fully cleared beach, readying himself to receive All Might's power. After swallowing the hair, gross, Izuku could almost immediately feel a difference. It was like a fluttering sensation in his stomach that was slowly spreading out through him. I feel it, mumbled Izuku incredulously. You do? Asked All Might. It should take a couple of hours at least, just enough time to work its way through you before your exam. Izuku rubbed the back of his head. I mean, I don't think I could go punching down mountains or anything, but I feel different, like I'm changing. All Might scrutinized him. Indeed you are, young Midoriya. Now, there's not much time. Go eat breakfast and prepare yourself. Yes sir. With that, Izuku set off back home. His mother was fluttering around the kitchen and hovering by him nervously. Normally that would set him off, but he was too distracted by the energy within him. It was kind of like he a broken bar, well, a fart. It was a sensation that kept building and building, like a dam ready to be released. It didn't feel painful, but it was unmistakable and impossible not to notice. Izuku didn't understand why All Might thought he wouldn't feel it. Thinking about it, turning his awareness inwards as it spread from his stomach to the crown of his head and the tips of his toes, occupied him until he reached Ui. In fact, he was so distracted that he nearly tripped over his own feet. Luckily a kind girl used her quirk to save him. Izuku was so absorbed in his thoughts that he wasn't even worried about sitting next to Kaken, and he was only a little bit embarrassed about having his muttering called out in front of everyone. When he finally lined up with the other contestants in front of the gate, noting that Kaken got sent to a different arena, he felt a broken bar excited. One for All had reached every corner of him. Izuku felt that he could use it in an instant. In fact, it was harder not to use it. Once the doors opened, all his competitors rushed in, but Izuku walked distractedly, looking down at his hands. To his awe, they started glowing, threaded with lines of energy that must be One for All. The power built and built and built until, whoa! He cried. It felt like his arm was about to explode. Izuku yanked back on the power and the glow subsided. Right, he had to be conscious of his limits. The stockpile had enough energy to immediately rip him to shreds from the inside, like a firecracker going off internally. He had to be careful not to surpass his threshold. Also, Izuku clicked his mouth shut. Mumbling was a habit, but he probably shouldn't talk about One for All's secrets out loud. Izuku tried to focus the energy to his arms again, but he had the same problem. Frowning, the boy focused on his issue. It was like he had broken bar by trying to empower his arms. He was creating a bottleneck of energy. All the power in his body was flowing towards his hands, as if even the energy in his torso and legs was shifting upwards to compensate. That created a sort of back pressure that made it incredibly difficult to modulate his strength. Reinforcing his shoulders didn't help either, because then he had to strengthen his chest, and then his core, and so on. Everything in his body was connected. After all, maybe if he enhanced his arms and his legs at the same time, it would prevent the back pressure from being so bad. But then, why not enhance everything? I've got it, Izuku cried. The problem was that he was trying to reinforce one part of his body, but his quirk encompassed all of him. One quirk for all his body. Duh. Izuku could see that he was glowing, like a cowl of energy surrounded him. It was just in time too, because at that moment, a robot with the number 1 on its arm leapt out in front of him. Izuku's body moved faster than he'd ever imagined, and almost before he realized what was happening, his fist punched through its head. "Ah, yes!" he shouted gleefully. There was a sting in his knuckles, like he punched a tree or something, but otherwise he was fine. 6 minutes and 2 seconds left. "Woo-ah!" cried Izuku. He immediately set off at a sprint. It was incredible how fast he could flit around the mock city. It didn't take long for him to encounter another robot, this time worth 2 points. Remembering the sting in his hand, Izuku decided to try kicking it instead since his shoe would pad him somewhat. It worked equally as well, maybe even better considering that his legs were stronger than his arms. Izuku quickly set upon other targets, sometimes poaching them from other examinees, much to their chagrin. "Sorry," he called over his shoulder. Izuku felt bad about it, but there just weren't enough enemies for everyone to get them. He was up to 11 points, but his arms and legs were seriously starting to sting. Izuku wondered if he could split his focus, using a portion of the energy to enhance his strength, and another portion to act as a sort of cushion for his body. "Ah!" Izuku yelped as he unexpectedly shot forward at an even faster pace. Oops, he forgot to account for the fact that cushioning himself meant that he could tolerate further enhancement. Suddenly a robot rounded the corner, directly in his path, and he smacked into it head first. Ow! Izuku rubbed at his forehead. The blow stung, but not as much as his previous attacks had. Plus, the robot lay before him, incapacitated. It worked. He cheered. "Damn it!" a voice cried. Suddenly, Izuku realized that there had been a whole crowd of kids following behind the enemy he just felled. Oh, it was a 3-pointer. They'd all been chasing it and he managed to defeat it by pure luck. Izuku chuckled awkwardly. Oops. Nevertheless, he was up to 14 points now. The crowd grumbled at him, but there wasn't any time to spare, so everyone dispersed quickly. They were almost out of time. Izuku sprinted around the arena, trying to find any opponents. He stumbled across a 2-pointer. This time, Izuku was expecting the greater increase in strength, and it was child's play to shoot forward and punch at it, making sure to reinforce his arm. There was still a sting when his knuckles made contact, but it was more akin to hitting a punching bag than a tree or a wall. 16 points. Only 1 minute left. There was a commotion off to his left and Izuku's jaw dropped. The 0-point enemy had made an appearance and it was no joke. Woo, what? They expect us to fight that thing? No way. It must a trick. We should probably. Izuku was so distracted by his mumbling and hypothesizing that he almost didn't see the girl stuck underneath the rubble. It was the same girl who saved him before the exams. He ran forwards, but he could tell that it was no use. Even with his quirk propelling him, he'd never reach her before the enemy. But maybe, if he used his full power, it would tear him apart. Izuku remembered what All Might told him after the incident with Kaken and the slime monster. A true hero puts his body on the line, no matter the cost. If he hesitated now, if he let someone get hurt because he was too afraid to be hurt himself, then he could never call himself a hero. Izuku finally stopped holding back. His power was like a massive river held back by a dam, and Izuku threw the floodgates open. He did his best to shield himself from the backlash, but it was like trying to kayak on a raging river. He could barely keep himself afloat. While he was flying through the air, Izuku was in agony. He'd probably broken his legs in multiple places, but at least they weren't blown off of him entirely. Focus. He'd have time for pain later. As he neared the robot's head, he gritted his teeth and reared back his fist. Even through the pain, Izuku was in awe of his new power. The 0-point bot was forced backwards, its head a mangled mess. Izuku had a brief moment to feel pride before the pain and gravity set in. As he was falling, Izuku tried desperately to come up with a plan. His arms and legs were broken, but maybe not completely unusable, and he still had one fresh arm. The ground approached rapidly, but just as he was going to attempt to stop his momentum, the pink-haired girl from earlier slapped him. His body suddenly became weightless and floated above the asphalt. Oh right, her quirk was zero gravity. The girl made an odd symbol with her hands and Izuku hit the ground with an oomph while she leaned over and stretched. Time's up. While he'd like to say that he bore his pain stoically and manfully, in actuality he pretty much laid in a heap, groaning, until the nurse lady literally kissed him better. Although his physical pain was gone, it was almost worse to walk out of the examination area, hearing the other kids talk about their points. Many of them had far more than 16. Even with the unbelievable power that All Might had given to him, Izuku had still been outperformed by way too many examinees to be comfortable. Maybe his less than impressive practical score would be offset by the written examination. Izuku just had to hope that it would be enough. The inclusion of rescue points was kind of obvious. In hindsight, there was more to becoming a hero than just being able to destroy some villain bots. Still, Izuku wasn't ashamed to admit that he cried more than a few tears after All Might's video. Plus, his 60 rescue points put his total practical score at 76, second place by 1 point to Kaken. It was a pretty familiar spot for Izuku. Even though Kaken gave off the airs of a guy who was all brawn and no brains, he was consistently at the top of their class in academics. Only Izuku had ever managed to beat him, and even then only rarely. If he'd had even another hour with his quirk to work out the kinks prior to the exam, maybe he would have gotten a better score than Kaken. Their middle school principal was ecstatic. Of course, not one, but 2 of his students had been accepted to the most prestigious high school in the nation. Izuku listened to the man gush with one ear. The rest of his focus was on Kaken, who seemed pensive. Izuku would take pensive that was better than angry. When the principal let them go, he and his friend walked side by side out of the building. Though no words were exchanged, Izuku couldn't help but vibrate a bit with nervousness. Kaken's reactions were always hard to predict. It had been a long time since he reacted universally with rage, at least when Izuku was involved, but this was serious business. Plus, 10 months of silence was a long time for his friends personally to change a little. When he couldn't handle the silence any longer, Izuku blurted, "Hey, are you mad at me, Kaken?" The blonde didn't look at him or stop walking. "I did tell you not to apply to Yui, deku." Surprisingly, the words weren't barked or strained. Rather, it was almost as if Kaken was talking about the weather. Izuku ducked his head. He couldn't think of anything to say in response. He couldn't say sorry, because in truth he wasn't sorry. Not at all. Eventually, Kaken stopped and turned towards him. "Your quirk finally showed up." It wasn't a question. Kaken wasn't stupid. He must know that there was no way quirkless Deku could manage to beat enough villain bots to get 16 points, let alone 60 rescue points. Izuku raised his eyes to meet Kaken's gaze. He was going to be a hero. He could have one awkward conversation without flinching. "Yeah," agreed Izuku. "It's an enhancement type quirk. I get physically stronger, but if I over-enhance myself I end up breaking bones. That's why I've been working out since for a while. My main limitation is the strength of my body. I got my rescue points by beating the 0-point bot to save someone, but broke both my legs and my right arm." Kaken stared at him stoically for a moment. "That's nothing like either of your parents' quirks." Normally, that statement would fluster Izuku quite a lot. He wasn't exactly the coolest cucumber in the grocery store. However, that was one observation that Izuku was well prepared to answer. He expected that he'd get that question many times throughout his life. Famous heroes had biographies written about them. After all, the chance of getting a quirk unrelated to your parents is small, but not as small as developing it in middle school. Mused Kakin, you started working out so much right after that slime villain thing, so it developed right after that. Izuku stayed quiet. It wasn't exactly right, but it was convenient. Even if he didn't get one for all that day, that had been the moment that changed the trajectory of his life. So it was almost the same thing. TCH. Typical. I was supposed to be the only one from this shitty middle school to get into UI. It was going to be my hero origin story. Instead, you fucking trying to save me from that dumbass shit of a villain awoke your quirk. I'm just the fucking damsel in your origin story, Kakin, protested Izuku weakly. Smoke was starting to drift up from Kakin's palms. The blonde's gaze was intense. Listen here, Deku, I am no one's side character. I beat you on the entrance exam, and I'm always going to beat you at UI, so don't get your hopes up. Izuku stood dumbfounded while Kakin stalked away. After about 20 meters, the blonde turned back and scowled at him. What the hell are you dawdling for, Deku? Startled, Izuku found himself jogging forward before considering what the heck he was doing. Aren't you a broken bar mad at me? Kakin scoffed. I'm fucking furious, nerd. He glanced at Izuku before muttering grudgingly, but you've always been a decent challenge in school. Keeps me sharp. I don't see why that should change in high school. Izuku grinned, turning away so that Kakin didn't see his pleased expression. He was pretty good at translating Kakin's, and that statement meant something along the lines of it wasn't my plan, but you're my friend, and if anyone had to get into UI, I am glad it was you. Maybe he should just count his blessings and let it go, but Izuku had no intention of being in Kakin's shadow forever. Kakin, Izuku said, you need to understand a broken bar. He slowed to a stop, looking Kakin in the eye so that the other boy could see how serious he was. My dream of broken bar is to be the #1 hero. You're amazing, but my goal is to beat you. Izuku raised a clenched fist, and I'm going to keep working harder and harder in order to win. So broken bar, you'd better watch your back, because I'm not going to slow down. If he thought his words would enrage Kakin, then he was mistaken. Instead, the blonde grinned, though the smile had a vicious edge to it. You can try, Deku. You can try. Ahead, Dagobah Beach was pretty at night. Izuku felt a jolt of pride when he realized that it was only pretty because of him, because of what he'd done to make it that way. All in all, Izuku was walking on clouds. He'd gotten second place in UI's entrance exams, and his mentor was the coolest hero to ever have lived. So maybe he wasn't paying as much attention to his surroundings as he should have. All Might, he called out jubilantly. What? All Might? Where? Oh, oops. It took a second to rectify his error, but then he and All Might could talk uninterrupted. Midoriya, boy, I'm so proud of you. You did better than I ever could have imagined. Well, that was it. His poor mother would have to pick out coffins for her only son because Izuku was dead. Completely dead. He'd somehow ascended straight to heaven without even realizing that he'd escaped his earthly chains, because there was no way this was real life. Izuku wasn't entirely convinced that he wasn't locked in an asylum, living out some crazy fantasy. He sniffled and wiped at his eyes, trying not to cry. Thanks All Might. I couldn't have done it without you. Izuku raised his watery gaze up to meet All Might's eyes. Thank you, Ayo Broken Bar. No one's ever believed in me like you did. The man grinned down at him fondly, and clasped him by both shoulders. Young Midoriya, all I did was give you the means to fulfill your potential. The hard work was all yours. You earned your spot at UI. I wasn't involved in the scoring at all. Truthfully, my boy, you were incredible. I never imagined that you'd be so natural at using one for all. You grasped its intricacies instantly. All Might, I just a broken bar did what felt right. Izuku still wasn't entirely convinced that this wasn't a dream. The man chuckled and tousled his hair. You've got excellent instincts, young Midoriya. That will take you far. Now the only challenge is training up your body to match. Yes, sir. Izuku sobered and nodded with conviction. The difference between the power I was using through most of the test and the full power I felt when I fought the 0-point body broken bar, it was incredible. All Might tapped at his lips thoughtfully. Indeed, I was blown away that you could modulate its power at all, so soon after receiving my quirk. Still, the energy you were using in the beginning, do you feel like that was the most you can channel without harming yourself? Izuku felt his power thrumming just under the surface of his skin. It was hard to believe that all that force could be contained just by his body. I was able to push my limits a little bit by using some energy to sort of cushion myself and reinforce my body, but I don't think that I could use any more power without breaking my bones and stuff. All Might blinked, surprised. What an excellent idea. Forget one for all. Your real power is up here. He tapped Izuku on the forehead. Izuku blushed. Still, I'd say that if what you used against the 0-point bot was 100% of your strength, then what you were using stably was about a broken bar. 5% of that. Maybe you can eke out a few more percentage points with that trick of yours. And the only way to bring that up is to make my body stronger and stronger, right? Got it. In one. Over time, your body will be able to handle a greater proportion of your power. Also, your maximum strength will increase as well. Your 100% is a long way off from my 100%. After all, I thought that I'd have to spend most of our time teaching you control, but luckily we can focus all our energy on training your body. You'll see, young Midoriya. Soon, you'll look back and be amazed at how far you'd come. I'm already amazed, All Might. I promise that I'll work harder than ever. Izuku knew that he still had a long way to go. Still a broken bar. He could see a broken bar. Midoriya Izuku, #1 hero. To say that Izuku was excited for his first day at UI would be a major understatement. He was practically vibrating, but he tried to keep himself contained. Can you believe it? We're going to be taught by a real pro hero. I wonder who it'll be. It would be so cool if it were Present Mick, don't you think? Oh, I heard that Midnight teaches there too. If she were our homeroom teacher, I don't think that I could ever answer a question. I'd be way too embarrassed. I'm way too embarrassed to be seen out in public with you right now. Deku. Sorry, Kaken. The two of them were on the commuter train that would stop close to UI. He and Kaken had resumed their tradition of walking to and from school together, now that their friendship was mostly repaired. Although they were talking to each other and hanging out again, they were still trying to figure out exactly how they fit together. Case in point, Izuku had been so busy musing about their first day that he didn't realize that they'd come to a stop. It wasn't their destination, but Izuku was blocking the exit. Complained Kaken, before he grabbed Izuku's upper arm and pulled him until they were flush, shoulder to shoulder. Kaken's hand lingered for a second before dropping and brushing against Izuku's thigh. It was completely normal for even complete strangers to have to squish together on the train during rush hour, but Kaken still blushed slightly. Sorry, Izuku called towards the passengers that he'd been blocking. Stop yelling in my ear, Deku, grumbled Kaken. Oh, sorry, Izuku whispered. And stop apologizing so much. You'll never be a pro hero if you can't grow some guts. Kaken leaned against him a little bit though, almost as if to take the sting out of his words. Right. Kaken had never been physically demonstrative with him, or anyone really. Recently, however, Izuku noticed that Kaken touched him more often. He'd knock shoulders with Izuku, or nudge him with his elbow, or like just now, grab him and move him rather than just tell Izuku to move. It was definitely odd but also kind of nice, so Izuku made sure not to comment on it. Kaken was easily embarrassed, even if he rarely showed it, and would probably stop if he knew Izuku had noticed. Izuku continued chattering until they got into UI's main building. Despite his cool fight Section 8, Izuku could tell that Kaken was anxious for their first day too, although probably not as much as him. He assumed that he was a pleasant distraction rather than an annoyance, because Kaken wouldn't hesitate to say so. When they reached the nosy reporters blocking their path, Kaken just yelled at them and burst straight through, but he grabbed Izuku and pulled him in his wake. Izuku grinned. Kaken probably wanted him around, then, since he could have used the crowd to ditch him if he felt like it. When they got into room 1A, Kaken immediately made a beeline for an open desk in the middle of the room. Izuku, however, was waylaid by the really intense guy from his examination group. Hello. The taller boy said, really a broken bar? intensely. I am Ida Tenya from Soumai Middle School, chuckled Izuku nervously. He unconsciously shuffled backwards a bit. I'm Midoriya Izuku. Midoriya Izuku, cried Ida. Why yes, I must hand it to you. You intuited the true nature of the practical examination. Ida turned away slightly, gritting his teeth and clenching his fist. Izuku inched backwards, but Ida shifted closer. Meanwhile, I had no idea. I completely misjudged you, Midoriya. I must apologize for speaking to you so disrespectfully when President Mick was explaining the rules. Clearly you were uncovering the true challenge while I allowed myself to be distracted. Please, will you shut up? Grunted Kaken. Izuku had backed up so far that he'd hit Kaken's desk. You're giving me a headache? Ida gasped. How can you speak to a fellow classmate so rudely? And get your feet off your desk. Seeing his opportunity to escape, Izuku cautiously sidestepped the taller boy and crept backwards. Izuku met Kaken's eyes and mouthed thank you. Kaken just scoffed and turned his head to the side, clearly ignoring both Izuku and Ida. After that, he met the girl from the practical exam, whose name he still didn't know considering that they were interrupted by their, rough-looking sensei. The man, Aizawa, must be a pro. But Izuku had no clue who he was. Considering Izuku's obsession with heroes, that said something. Either this guy was really, really good at being sneaky, or so bad that Izuku'd never heard of him. The latter was virtually impossible, because Izuku knew everyone in the hero circuit. He'd give his teacher the benefit of the doubt. Plus, he had a feeling that Aizawa was the real deal, and he'd learned to trust his instincts, before Izuku could get his bearings. Mr. Aizawa was herding them into their uniforms and out onto the field. Apparently they were going to have a quirk assessment test, with a lot of exercises they did in middle school, except this time they could use their quirks to boost their scores. The teacher had Kaken demonstrate, and Izuku goggled at how far his friend was able to blast the softball. Whoa, that's amazing Kaken, good work, gushed Izuku. HMPH, that was nothing. Deku, next time I'll get 800 meters, grumped Kaken, but he looked pleased at the praise. Oh, Mr. Aizawa added nonchalantly, and whoever places last overall will be expelled. The students stared at him. You're joking, right? One brave red-headed boy asked. Mr. Aizawa just smiled at them humorlessly. This isn't a game. You're all training to be heroes. It's a cutthroat profession, with a very real chance of being hurt or killed. No one will go easy on you in the real world, so don't expect me to go easy on you here. The teacher met Izuku's eyes. Besides, I had a reputation to maintain. We accept the best, but we only graduate the best of the best. We've got no interest in putting out inferior heroes just because you were lucky enough to make it past a few robots. Their teacher stared at them silently long enough for that statement to sink in before starting them on the 50-meter dash. Izuku was impressed by the creativity his classmates displayed using their quirks. Kaken blasted himself like a missile, of course, but one boy propelled himself with a laser in his navel, and a girl somehow pulled a rocket-powered bicycle out of her body and smoked her partner. Izuku took the opportunity to marvel at the scene. He'd never seen so many incredible quirks used openly like this. He was practically in nirvana. He was a bit anxious at the prospect of being expelled, but his quirk was ideal for physical tests like these. Indeed, when his turn came, Izuku handily beat his partner, a girl who strongly resembled a frog. Wow! She cheered. Your quirk-eyed awesome, Ribbit. I'm pretty sure Ita's the only one who was faster than you. And speed's kind of his thing, you know. Izuku chuckled sheepishly. Ah, no, the girl with the creation quirk was faster than both of us, actually. His partner grinned. Still, you should have no problem on these tests. I'm Asuitsu by the way, but call me Tsu. Oh, Izuku couldn't help but smile as well. I'm, Midoriya Izuku. Nice to meet you Asuitsu, she corrected firmly. Right, sorry Tsu, quit dawdling, called Aizawa. Didn't I say that you all aren't here to make friends? Sorry sensei, the two of them replied. Still, Tsu winked and whispered to him. Good luck Midoriya. Do your best. You too, Tsu. Izuku marveled at Tsu's kindness. They were technically competing against each other but she showed no signs of it. He was pretty sure that he just made a new friend. Next they tested grip strength. Izuku thought for sure that he'd have an advantage on this one, but a guy with 6 arms and someone who had a sugar-based stockpiling quirk beat him outright. The girl with the creation quirk made some sort of mechanical clamp. Izuku kind of thought that was cheating, but Mr. Aizawa allowed it without question. Needless to say, she got first place in that exercise. Izuku grew increasingly disquieted as the pattern repeated itself. He always did well, consistently placing in the top 5. With the exception of the standing long jump, there were tons of people in the class who could rocket themselves through the air, or glide, or turn themselves weightless, or leap like a frog, etc. A few other students had things that they excelled at, something that truly distinguished them. Ida did amazingly on the 50-meter dash. Kaken and the pink-haired girl impressed in the softball throw. Izuku managed a respectable 400 meters in the event, but considering Kaken's 700-plus meter throw, it was nothing to write home about. Even though he doubted that he'd end up near the bottom, Izuku still wished that he could do something really special. He was somewhat mollified by his showing during the sit-ups event. His strength-to-weight ratio was by far the greatest in the class, and Izuku had access to a virtually unlimited energy source. It wasn't too complicated to tweak his ability a little bit, sacrificing peak strength in favor of endurance. Izuku continued doing sit-ups long after everyone else had finished, until Mr. Aizawa got bored. Alright, you win this one, Midoriya. I'll just mark you down as infinity and move on. Geez, for someone who'd threatened to expel a student based on their exam marks, Mr. Aizawa didn't seem to actually care that much about their results. He acted like the whole charade was just one big inconvenience to him. Nevertheless, that was one event at least that Izuku excelled at. The endurance run went similarly. That girl with the creation quirk beat him, but only because she remade the motorized bike that won her the 50-meter dash. Izuku understood that it was a quirk assessment test, but surely it wasn't fair for one student to have a motor scooter while everyone else had to run. The tests ended with the sitting toe touch, where Izuku embarrassed himself by placing dead last in the class. His training had optimized physical strength, often at the expense of flexibility. Plus, there was a student who could actually grow longer limbs. He couldn't compete with that. At the conclusion of the events, Class 1A gathered anxiously around Mr. Aizawa, who posted the results without fanfare. Yaozu Momo, Todoroki Shadow, Bakugo Katsuki, Ida Tenya, Tokoyami Fumikage, Shoji Mezzo, Midoriya Izuku, Ojiro Mashirao, Kirishima Jiro, Ashido Mina, Yoraraka Okiko, Koda Koji, Sato Rikido, Asuitsu, Omayuga, Saruhanta, Kaminari Denki, Kyokujiro, Hagakure, Mineta Minaro. Mr. Aizawa. Well, that's it. We're done for the day. Pick up a syllabus from the classroom and read it over before tomorrow morning. He glanced over at a boy who had strange, purple balls on his head instead of hair. Mineta, don't bother coming back tomorrow. You can talk to administration about transferring to the general studies course, or not. I don't really care. Feel free to keep the uniform, though I doubt it'd fit anyone else. What? Asked Mineta, his voice breaking. That's a joke, right? Nope, replied Mr. Aizawa, not even turning around. You got last place. You're expelled, just like I said in the beginning. Mineta looked too stunned to protest. Not that it would have mattered. Mr. Aizawa strolled out of the clearing before anyone could respond anyway. There was an awkward silence among the students, before Mineta started sniffling, and then ran off behind a building. His crying was audible. Most of Izuku's other classmates did as they were told and retreated back to the classroom, including Kaken. They didn't actually know Mineta after all, and had no obligation to try to comfort him. Still, Izuku couldn't just leave knowing his fellow former classmate was in such a position. Ida, Tsu, and the pink-haired girl seemed to have a similar thought process. The four of them cautiously approached Mineta. Are you alright? Izuku asked. What Mr. Aizawa did was too cruel, cried Ida. There's more to being a hero than just physical fitness tests. Please leave me alone. Mineta sniffled. I don't want to talk about it. Izuku and Ida exchanged glances. Well, it'd be rude to linger now. Even if he felt awful for the other boy, the pink-haired girl was undeterred. I'm Uraraka Okiko, Sorry we didn't get a chance to talk earlier. It's just a broken bar, you shouldn't give up. You never know what might happen. Mineta gave her a watery glare. It's over. My dream is toast. It was stupid to think that I could become a hero anyways. Tsu just sat down silently next to Mineta, wrapping her arms around her knees. After a moment, she said, you know, Ribbit, UI allows students from the General Studies course to transfer into the Heroics course after the annual sports festival. It's open to General Studies students, so they can compete and try to impress the teachers. If you do well, you can show Mr. Reizawa what a mistake it was to look down on you. Your dream doesn't have to end here, not if you don't want it to. Mineta's mouth fell open. You mean? A broken bar, I need to think. Thanks for, you know. But, can you just a broken bar give me a little bit? Yeah sure, Tsu replied before the rest of them could respond. I'll just hang out over there for a little bit in case you change your mind. She gestured to a tree around the corner. You guys should go ahead and get going, she said to Ida, Uraraka, and Izuku. He had to admit that he felt somewhat relieved to be given an out. Ida and Uraraka seemed to feel the same way, because neither of them protested. It was a somewhat solemn walk back to the classroom, but it was hard to keep up the negative attitude once they'd gotten their things and started heading home. After all, none of them actually knew Mineta, not really, and all three of them had placed really well in the rankings. It was hard not to be at least a little excited about the day's proceedings. I guess I never really introduced myself. My name is Uraraka Okako, Yorida Tenya, and you're Midoriya Deku, right? Izuku blinked at her, surprised. Where'd you hear that? Uraraka stared back guilelessly. Isn't that what the exploding boy called you? He chuckled nervously and rubbed the back of his head. Oh, me and Kaken have known each other since we were kids. That's just his nickname for me. My name's actually Izuku. So it's an insult? Cried Ida. And no, well, Kaken's pretty good at making anything he says sound like an insult, so I see where you'd get that impression. Plus, it actually had started as an insult, during the phase when Kaken had been really mad at him, but then they made up and Kaken punched a kid in the grade above them who called him Deku snidely. But Kaken doesn't even bother learning most people's actual names. I was the only person growing up whom he had a real nickname for, rather than just some weird description like curly hair boy or hey you. I like it, declared Uraraka brightly. It kind of gives off a you can do it vibe. Oh, Izuku blushed. You can call me Deku, if you want. Before Uraraka could respond, they'd reached the train station, and found Kaken leaning against the wall next to the door. Fucking finally, he sighed gustily. Took you long enough, Deku. Why are you wasting time with these extras? Extras? Ida sputtered indignantly. Izuku felt his face morph into a horrified expression. Kaken, don't be so rude. Ida and Uraraka are really nice. Whatever. Kaken grabbed Izuku's wrist and dragged him off in the direction of their train home. Izuku craned his head around and waved at his new friends. Bye Ida. Bye Uraraka. Sorry about Kaken. I'm sure he didn't mean it. Actually, he was sure that Kaken did mean it. But sometimes a white lie was superior to the truth. See you tomorrow. Bye Deku. Uraraka called back. She calls you Deku? Muttered Kaken once they were out of earshot. He honest to God pouted, although he'd probably claim it was a scowl. Izuku managed to repress his laugh, but couldn't stop his eyes from rolling upwards. Well, maybe if you didn't call me that before anyone even knew my real name, it wouldn't have stuck. Whatever. Kaken tugged on his wrist a bit, making him stumble. Izuku grinned. That meant that he couldn't think of an adequate verbal response. 1 point to Deku. If any of them call me fucking Kaken, though, I'll fucking kill them. Izuku chuckled sheepishly, but he felt warmed by the fact that Kaken hadn't ever had a problem with Izuku using the nickname. Don't worry Kaken, I'm pretty sure that no one would be so familiar with you. He was pretty sure their classmates would be too intimidated by Kaken's prickly exterior to call him such a casual nickname. Izuku grinned and leaned his shoulder against Kaken's. Since that was apparently something they did now, today was pretty exciting, don't you think? It was amazing seeing everybody's quirks. I'm kind of intimidated by Mr. Aizawa, though. I can't believe that he expelled a student on the first day. Kaken rolled his eyes. What are you worried about? You scored in the top half of the class. Izuku blushed and grinned down at his shoes. Kaken must have looked for his ranking, since his own spot was higher. If he'd just been scanning the board from the top down for his own name, he would have stopped before seeing Izuku's ranking. They boarded their train, and stood together by the doors. Izuku held onto the pole in the middle, and Kaken grabbed the handle of Izuku's backpack, resting the rest of his arm on the bag. Izuku beamed at him. This was probably the closest Kaken had ever been to slinging an arm around him. The blonde scowled and looked to the side, but he didn't move away at all. Only Kaken could make a smile look pleased. Hey Kaken? Said Izuku shyly. The other boy didn't respond, but he glanced over so Izuku knew he was listening. Thanks. For what? Kaken asked gruffly. For being my friend. Kaken huffed, and tugged on his backpack so that Izuku's shoulder was pressed to the other boy's chest. Whatever, Deku. You're alright, Kaken said, as if he weren't. Over the next few days, Izuku settled into his new high school routine. In the mornings, it was just like any other school. They were taught English by President Mick, along with all sort of normal subjects. However, their afternoons were dedicated entirely to hero work. For at least an hour every day they had a physical conditioning class conducted by All Might. It was beyond bizarre to see his mentor dressed up in a tweed suit, trying to pass himself off as a normal teacher. However, Izuku managed to look kind of cool and aloof. For once he was one of the few students able to talk with All Might without stammering. Luckily Izuku had the benefit of being coached by All Might for nearly a year, else he'd be the biggest fanboy of them all. Of course, the afternoon hero courses weren't just physical. They also learned about laws and regulations of heroics, how to run a hero agency, and first aid, amongst other things. Plus, every once in a while, they'd have a special event, kind of like the one happening tomorrow. Aren't you excited, Kaken? Battle training sounds really neat. I wonder what All Might's going to have us do. I'm looking forward to crushing all those extras in our class. Yeah. Izuku turned his gaze skyward in exasperation. After nearly a week of high school, Kaken still didn't know a single one of their classmates' names. Plus, he continued his trend of calling them extras to their faces. All in all, it didn't win him too many friends. It was really strange for Izuku to be more popular than Kaken, but at least Kaminari and Kirishima didn't seem too put off by Kaken's prickliness. The two of them were on the train again. Kaken was standing unnecessarily close, holding on to Izuku's backpack again. Izuku wasn't sure what was going on. He and Kaken didn't talk much at school. Kaken preferred to read or do homework during lunch, even though he'd sit with them all. Instead, Izuku started spending more time with his classmates, particularly Ida, Uraraka, and Tsu. However, the more he hung out with his other friends, the more Kaken sulked, even though Izuku always tried to include him, and was inevitably turned down. Then, as soon as school let out, Kaken crowded close to him on the train. The handle of Izuku's backpack became Kaken's favorite place to hold on to, and they'd spend their commute home brushing against each other before heading to one of their apartments to do homework. You shouldn't be so cocky, Kaken. Everyone in our class is amazing, and we all passed the same entrance exam. You never know what they might be capable of. Kaken scoffed. TCH. As if any of them could even make me sweat. He leaned a little more of his weight against Izuku. His pulse quickened. Oh okay, if you say so, Kaken. He hoped his voice didn't tremble from the odd feeling in his stomach. Izuku really wasn't certain what was going on with Ama Broken Bar, but he knew it was nice. Standing there with Kaken leaning against him, it gave Izuku a weird feeling in his chest. It was like his ribs were too tight, but also like he could float away if Kaken weren't tethering him down. Every time they brushed against each other, his skin tingled and he had to suppress a shiver. Izuku had always been in awe of Kaken, but this sensation was new. It was strange and uncomfortable, but in a good way. He wanted Kaken's eyes on him, and he wanted Kaken to stand too close to him. So it was beyond frustrating when Kaken scowled at him and retreated whenever Izuku brushed their shoulders together at school, but then crowded up against him as soon as their classmates were out of sight. Plus, Tension had been building during the past week. Kaken's sulkiness got worse as time passed. Part of Izuku wanted to just throw his hands up and let Kaken figure it out himself. Paying attention to him didn't work, and not paying attention to him was even worse. However, the bigger part of him knew that he really liked the, whatever they were doing, and he was afraid that if he left Kaken to deal with it on his own, things would just blow up in their faces. That was the blonde's specialty, after all, so he thought he knew what he had to do, and he was pretty sure he had to do it soon. Izuku, just a broken bar, tended to wimp out every time he tried. The problem was that after school, Kaken was always the one reaching out to him to grab him or lean on him or, whatever. And even though it was more than just a broken bar, Kaken always made sure to keep things well within the boundaries of, The thing was, Izuku knew that it wasn't just and Kaken wasn't dumb. He must know that Izuku knew. God, Izuku couldn't even think it, let alone say it. And anyway, Kaken was the brave one, always blazing a path ahead without any hesitation. But still, it must be hard for him to keep, doing stuff when he wasn't even sure if Izuku of in a broken bar, a broken bar back. Oh my god, Deku, stop fucking mumbling. People are staring at us. Oh number. Izuku finally noticed that Kaken was stiff as a board next to him, grip white on the support pole. People were indeed giving him weird looks, but that wasn't the issue. Izuku's mumbling was definitely off-putting and a bit incoherent, but pretty easy to decipher if one stood as close to him as Kaken was currently. His face burned and was probably glowing like a neon light. If he'd said all that out loud, a broken bar, if Kaken had heard all that, then there was a difference between Kaken probably knowing that Izuku knew and knowing that Izuku knew. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku could see Kaken's jaw clench, and feel him start to shift away to put space between them. Before he could think about it, or consider the pros and cons and do in-depth analyses a broken bar, most importantly, before he could wimp out, Izuku's arm wrapped itself around Kaken's waist. Oh god, if he'd thought his face was burning before, that was nothing. Izuku wasn't even entirely sure that he was breathing. Nope, he was definitely not breathing. He should probably start breathing again. Jesus fuck, Deku, take a fucking breath. I'm not going to kill you. Izuku sucked in a lungful of air, and dared to peek at Kaken through his fringe. The other boy was glowering at him, but Izuku knew the difference between his "I want to kill you" scowl, and his "Bakugo Katsuki is too cool to smile, so I'm scowling instead" scowl. One the terror baited. Izuku started to feel a broken bar good, really good, actually. He didn't even notice that he was beaming at Kaken until the blonde blushed and looked away. It's just a hug, Deku, not $1,000,000. Kaken muttered. It, kinda feels like $1,000,000 to me, Izuku admitted shyly. Kaken stared at him, before barking out a laugh. Deku, that was the cheesiest shit I've ever heard in real life. Except, Kaken shifted his arm so that instead of grabbing onto his backpack, it was slung around his shoulders. Izuku counted it as a win. He still had no freaking idea what to make of their broken bar everything, but the weird tension between them seemed to have gone away. It was like Izuku let out a massive breath that he didn't even know he'd been holding. Izuku wasn't sure if he'd made the right decision, but he didn't regret it. How could he, with Kaken's arm a line of heat across his shoulders? Still, this might make everything go up in flames. Izuku shivered when the train hit a bump, causing Kaken's grip to tighten reflexively. Well, whatever happened, Izuku was going along for the ride. Their commute into school the next day was really a broken bar nice. When Izuku bid goodbye to his mom and climbed down the stairs to the ground floor of his apartment complex, he found Kaken waiting for him out front. Kaken had casually wrapped his arm around Izuku's shoulders as if he did that every day, and Izuku timidly put his own around the boy's waist. They'd stayed in that position for more or less the entire trip, chatting about what battle training would entail. On a related note, Izuku grinned for almost the whole train ride. However, once they got to the train station by school, Kaken stiffened and slid smoothly away from Izuku, making his way outside. Izuku was disappointed, but it was kind of big deal to saunter into high school like that, especially since they hadn't bothered talking about a broken bar anything. Yet, he worried his bottom lip and caught up to Kaken, who was standing by the station's entrance and looking back at him in exasperation. Hey, he'd probably been muttering again, the closer they got to school. Though, the deeper Kaken's scowl became. The blonde brushed against Izuku a few times, arm twitching as if it wanted to return to its previous spot. Izuku's breath caught every time it happened, secretly hoping that Kaken would do it. By the time Uui's gates were in sight, Izuku and Kaken were walking so closely that their shoulders bumped against each other with every step, but still Kaken didn't go any further than that. Izuku mustered up his courage long enough to say Kaken, but his words failed him after that. You couldn't just tell someone that you wanted them to put their arms around you. That would be horrifically, indescribably awkward. But Izuku miscalculated, because he'd already gotten Kaken's attention, so he had to say something. Instead, Izuku compromised by staring at Kaken's arm, and then the school gates, and then back at the arm, all while kind of shrugging his shoulders. He thought it was a pretty decent pantomime, but apparently his message didn't get across correctly, because Kaken looked almost a broken bar hurt, for an instant, before his expression returned to his standard scowl, and he took a step away from Izuku. Fine, Deku. If the thought of, no, blurted Izuku. He had no idea what Kaken was going to say, but there was no way the blonde was interpreting what Izuku thought of correctly. Izuku's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. He physically could not make himself say the words, like they were stuck behind his teeth. He was running out of time though, because Kaken was looking more and more irritated, shoulders hunching up defensively. You see a broken bar, it's just you, and I, also, that is, Kaken, wait. Kaken didn't wait. Instead, he began pivoting back towards the school. Desperately, Izuku's hand shot out and a broken bar grabbed onto Kaken's hand, and, stayed there. Kaken froze, but his hand reflexively tightened around Izuku's. He couldn't see Kaken's expression, since his friend was turned away from him. Oh God! If there was truly an all-powerful, benevolent higher power in this universe, then it should smite him where he stood. Really, it'd be an act of mercy. Himadrya Izuku was holding Bakugo Katsuki's hand, and there was no way this was going to end well for him. I just, thought. You probably don't want to, but if you did want to, that ice a broken bar. Izuku had started out basically mumbling, but by the end he trailed off into a decibel audible to only dormice. Stupid, stupid, stupid. God, Deku, way to ruin everything. To make things even worse, he could feel his eyes welling up with tears. Why did he have to be such a crybaby all the time? Izuku couldn't imagine anything more humiliating than standing in front of his high school and crying because Kaken wouldn't hold his hand. Unbidden, a single sniff escaped him, cutting the thick silence like a knife. Suddenly, Izuku was tugged forward, but Kaken didn't let go of his hand. His eyes darted up to Kaken's face, and the other boy looked almost a broken bar fond. Deku. Izuku had never heard Kaken say his nickname so tenderly. Kaken was probably embarrassed that he sounded so soppy, because he cleared his throat and tried to scowl. It didn't quite come out right though, still looking a little bit like a smile. We're going to be late, come on, Kaken said gruffly, before tugging him towards Uuai. It took Izuku a few steps to realize that Kaken pulling him by his hand meant that Kaken was still holding his hand, and by the time they got through the gates into school, he understood that Kaken had no intention of letting go of his hand. Oh wow, Kaken's holding my hand. Okay, no problem, just remember to breathe. Keep putting one foot in front of the other. Deku, you're mumbling again. Izuku giggled nervously and cut himself off, but instead of being embarrassed he felt euphoric. He'd had no idea that his hand was directly connected to so many dopamine receptors in his brain. Izuku was walking in school, with Kaken, holding hands, and Kaken didn't even look angry. Well, whenever someone's gaze lingered on them for too long, Kaken shot them a truly murderous glare that quickly sent them scurrying on their way. But other than that he didn't seem angry. Izuku's head was so far in the clouds that they'd walked into class 1A before he realized that he wasn't completely sure he wanted to deal with the fallout of his entire class seeing him and Kaken like that. He didn't have time to consider what to do next before Kirishima waved at them. Hey Rikugo and Midoriya are holding hands. It was eerie how quickly everyone else's conversations ground to an instant halt, while all the heads in the room swiveled towards the door simultaneously. Kaken bristled. Yeah? You got a fucking problem with it? Shit for brains? Kirishima raised his hands, palms facing outwards. No way, dude, I was just surprised, is all. I mean, I knew Midoriya's quirk was pretty cool, but I didn't realize it was so strong. Izuku and Kaken glanced at each other, confused. My quirk? Izuku asked tentatively. Yeah. Agreed Kirishima brightly. It must make you invincible. I mean, I can turn my whole body into stone, but even I'd be too afraid of getting my arm blown off to hold hands with Bakugo. The classroom was absolutely silent while everyone processed that statement, before Kaken exploded. You fucker, I'll kill you. He let go of Izuku and lunged towards the redhead. Kirishima cackled and dodged out of the way. Izuku gaped at the two of them for a moment, before Uraraka prodded him in the side. She and Ida had sidled up to him while Kaken was distracted. So, she grinned. You and Bakugo, huh? At this point, Izuku was pretty sure that his face would turn permanently red. What, me and Kaken? What about us? You're wondering if we're really good friends? Because we are, you know, really good friends. We grew up together. We've always been great friends, even if our relationship, I mean, not relationship, friendship, you know? Even if it was sometimes pretty explosive. Haha, get it? Explosive? Ha a broken bar. Uraraka seemed stunned by his deluge of words. Her mouth opened, but she paused and turned to Ida. Ida shrugged. The girl visibly gathered herself before trying again. Deku, of course we know that you and Bakugo are good friends. And me and Didi don't care if you and him are friends or, other things. It's just, she coughed. Boyfriends don't usually hold hands. Boyfriends? Izuku squeaked shrilly. Who said anything about toe? You mean boyfriends? Izuku enunciated the last two words far more than necessary. As in friends who are boys. Boyfriends, I mean friends who are boys hold hands all the time. Desperately, Izuku grabbed Ida's hand. See? Ida and I are friends who are boys and we're holding hands right now. Ida's face colored, but just as fast as the blush appeared, it drained away. He stared in horror over Izuku's shoulder. Izuku suddenly realized that he couldn't hear Kaken's chant of die, 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 die anymore. He gulped and turned his head slowly. In the back of the classroom, Kaken had caught Kirishima and had one hand clenched in the redhead shirt, and the other raised into a fist. Kaken's eyes, however, were laser-locked on Ida and Izuku's joined hands. Private school. Kaken hissed out his nickname for Ida. What are you doing holding Deku's hand? Ida jerked out of Izuku's grasp like it burned. I wasn't, the bespectacled boy said eloquently. Oh yeah, totally normal friends who are boys behavior. Here, muttered Uraraka. Kaken dropped Kirishima and stalked towards Ida. Ally, drawled Kaken darkly, because it sure looked like, as fascinating as this all is, it's time for class to start. Mr. Reizawa was slumped against the lectern at the front of the room, sleeping bag zipped up to his chin. Izuku hadn't seen or heard him enter at all. And actually I don't care at all about your angst. Kaken stopped in his tracks, scowling at Ida, and slid his finger against his neck in the classic "you're dead" motion. Ida got to his seat so fast that he must have used his quirk. Once the bespectacled boy's back was turned, Kaken's lips twitched, betraying his mirth. Seeing it kind of made Izuku feel like Uraraka had used her quirk on just his insides, so he brushed his hand against Kaken's intentionally as they made their way to their seats. He smiled up at the blonde through his bangs. Thanks, Kaken, Izuku whispered. He didn't even know what for, he just knew that despite his embarrassment, he was really happy. Kaken huffed and looked away, but he totally failed at scowling. Plus, his face. Whoa, Bakugo, are you blushing? Kirishima apparently had literally zero self-preservation instincts. Shut the fuck up, you bastard! Roared Kaken, who lunged at Kirishima again. The redhead squawked and flinched backwards, but Mr. Reizawa's scarf wrapped itself around Kaken and restrained him. Seriously? Barked Mr. Reizawa. Shut up and sit down. I can and will give you detention, to be served this afternoon. Their first battle trial was supposed to be this afternoon. As far as threats went, it was extremely effective. Great, muttered Aizawa once they were all seated and attentive. Now that that's all taken care of, let's get started. It had been minor torture, sitting there like it was a perfectly normal day, as though every student in Class 1A weren't staring at the clock, waiting for the afternoon to come. It seemed like enough hours passed to fill 3 school days when All Might finally took over. In the locker room, Izuku absent-mindedly wondered what everyone else's costumes would look like, until he accidentally glimpsed Kaken's bare chest. Blushing bright red, Izuku stammered something that even he thought was incoherent, before turning back to his own locker and hurriedly donning his hero costume. He'd mainly kept the design that his mother made for him, given that she worked so hard on it, but he asked the support department for armored gauntlets and boots. Punching and kicking those robots during the entrance exam had stung something fierce. Izuku was pretty pleased to end up on a team with Uraraka, even though she gave him a sly look like she wanted to continue their conversation from the morning. Luckily she didn't have a chance, since they were selected for the first battle. He gulped when he realized that they were going to face off against Kaken and Ida. "Are you nervous to fight To fight Bakugo?" Uraraka asked as they were setting up. Izuku frowned. "Yeah, a little," he admitted. Their whatever was so new, and he wasn't sure it'd survive a fight so soon, but I'm more excited. I haven't told anyone in high school, but I didn't actually develop my quirk until last year." Uraraka gasped. "Really? That's so rare." "Yeah," nodded Izuku. "And a broken bar, you have to understand. Kaken is incredible." He looked over to see Uraraka hiding a smile behind her hand. "And no, I'm not just saying that because of, you know. And I know that he's surly and hard to get along with, but he's amazing. He's always been effortlessly strong, and unbelievably smart. He's ambitious, and confident no matter what challenge he faces. For as long as I've known him, he's always been at the top of, well, everything. Grades, athletics, you name it. I've followed him around our whole lives, just to a broken bar bask in his glory, kind of. He's always been my measuring stick, my goal." Izuku swallowed and stared at the ground. "It's kind of strange to say it out loud, but we've been waiting for this forever. You know how quickly he judges people." "Oh yeah," Uraraka snorted. "I've definitely seen that." He blushed and chuckled. "He's always been that way about every broken bar, everyone except for me. I could always challenge him in academics, but hero stuff, we never really got a chance to see about that. So instead we just a broken bar waited, and while we waited we became friends, real friends. And I don't want him to see me the way he sees everyone else. I watch him all the time, and he's always so cool." Izuku bit his lip and shrugged. "I want him to a broken bar look at me that way too, you know?" When he raised his eyes, Izuku saw that Uraraka was holding her hands in front of her mouth, and had stars in her eyes. "Deku," she said, and her expression morphed to one of intense determination. "We're going to win. You already are amazing. The way you took out that 0-point bot to save me in the entrance exam, a broken bar, it was incredible." She punched the air, as if in demonstration. "When we beat Bakugo and Iida, he'll be forced to see it too. True love will prevail." "Woo-ah," flailed Izuku. "True love?" His voice was an octave higher than intended. "Haha, that's a little hasty, don't you think? We've barely even held hands. Besides, we're just friends." Uraraka sighed. "Boys." Luckily, he was saved by the bell, or in this case, All Might's voice. Indoor battle trial, a broken bar begin. He and Uraraka's eyes met, and they nodded determinedly. Using Uraraka's quirk, they floated up to the 3rd floor, sneaking in through a window. They tried to sleuth stealthily through the hallways, and Izuku thought they were doing pretty well until Kaken appeared in a burst of flame. He'd been prepared to use one for all, its energy humming just beneath his skin this whole time. Therefore, Izuku was able to grab Uraraka and dodge backwards without getting hit. He stared grimly at the scorch marks on the wall. He hadn't suspected that Kaken would hold back at all, even considering their, thing. But still, it was intimidating to see his hunch confirmed. "That's a pretty cool power, Deku," Kaken smirked. "You think it can stand up to mine?" There was a glint of hunger in his gaze, and normally that'd freak Izuku out. But right now a broken bar he understood completely. He'd spent so many years watching Kaken and waiting, but now Kaken's gaze was on him and him alone. Izuku thought he was just as desperate for this fight as Kaken. "Uraraka," Izuku said, not once taking his eyes off their enemy. "Try to find Ida. I'll take care of this." She agreed and ran off in the other direction. Kaken didn't even twitch. "You're gonna take care of me, huh? Got a quirk and all of a sudden you became a cocky little shit." Anyone else would be insulted, but Izuku could see how pleased Kaken was. "I've been observing you for years. I know all your moves, but you don't know any of mine. Maybe you should put your money where your mouth is." "Deku!" yelled Kaken as he sprinted forward. He felt the energy of his quirk thrumming inside of him, and Izuku was anxious to move. Still, he was patient until Kaken cocked back his right arm. Izuku slid his left foot backwards, preparing to pivot the other boy over his shoulder. Before the blow could connect, though, Kaken let out an explosion from his right hand. That didn't make sense. It was too early. Izuku slammed into the wall. Of course, the explosion had changed Kaken's direction, allowing him to punch out with his left hand instead. He didn't have time to think though, because Kaken was on him in an instant. Izuku was forced to backpedal, desperately blocking Kaken's flurry of blows. He could shield himself with one for all so that the explosions didn't hurt, but the force of them still sent him reeling. "Thanks for warning me that you knew all my moves, Deku. I figured I'd switch things up," cackled Kaken. Izuku scowled. Damn, his big mouth had given away his greatest advantage. Well, two could play at that game. Instead of blocking the next explosion, he focused more energy to his front and let it hit him head on. Izuku rolled backwards with the force of it. Sure enough, Kaken hesitated for just a moment, surprised at the sudden change. Kaken had backed him up against a corner, and when he completed his roll, Izuku's feet were braced against the wall. Skin crackling with power, he uncoiled and shot forward, tackling Kaken around his middle. The blonde grunted as he hit the ground below him, and Izuku fumbled for the capture tape that would tag Kaken out. Before he could though, Kaken stretched his arms out above his head and used his explosions to propel himself out from underneath Izuku. Then, he used Izuku's trick and bounced off the wall towards him, but Izuku ducked in time. Izuku took a breath and calmed himself down. This wasn't working. "Catch me if you can, Kaken." He turned around and sprinted away through the maze. Kaken might be able to keep up with his top speed, but he wasn't as maneuverable as Izuku through the tight corners. Kaken was right. He'd been way too cocky, assuming that his foreknowledge of Kaken's fighting style in One for All would even out their gap in skill. But standing tall and blasting through any challenge had always been Kaken's strength. Izuku did his best when he had time to plan and analyze, so as he ran he tried to strategize. "The tight confines are both an advantage and disadvantage," mumbled Izuku. "It gives Kaken clear lines of sight to use his explosions. It's hard to fight him head-on because he can blast the whole area in front of him. But it also means that I'm more maneuverable than him, and with my quirk all I need is one direct hit to incapacitate him." He thought about how he'd caught Kaken off guard before, by kicking off the wall. A broken bar that might. "Deku." Izuku jumped before he realized that it was Uraraka, speaking through their headsets. "Not Kaken. I found the bomb. It's on the middle room on the 5th floor, but Ida removed everything from the room that I could use my quirk on. Come up when you get the chance." Before he could respond, there was an explosion in front of him, as Kaken appeared from around the next corner. "Stop running, Deku." Instead of stopping, Izuku jumped up and somersaulted over Kaken. The flabbergasted look on his face was priceless. When he was completely upside down, Izuku kicked off the ceiling and punched downwards. Kaken managed to avoid getting decked in the head, but Izuku grazed his front and sent the blonde stumbling. He pressed the advantage, advancing on Kaken. The other boy was much better on his heels than Izuku had been, and used his explosions judiciously to keep from being overwhelmed. Still, he was clearly disadvantaged. Kaken could only create explosions from his palms, and so he had to move his whole arm to aim for Izuku's constantly shifting position. Izuku stepped up onto the wall and kicked out with his other foot. Kaken blocked that, but Izuku landed a punch onto the boy's shoulder. Because of the awkward angle, There wasn't enough force for it to be debilitating, but even a glancing blow strengthened by one for all would majorly smart. You have to point and shoot, Kaken. But I can strike from any direction. Kaken didn't reply, too busy keeping track of Izuku's erratic, springing movements. He was wearing Kaken down. He was going to win. Finally, Kaken overextended himself. Izuku had tripped him up so that he was stumbling backwards, and had gotten inside his guard. There it was, his chance. Izuku's fist was cocked back. A punch to the face would. His punch didn't connect. It wasn't because Kaken blocked it. Izuku's plan had been perfect. Had a broken bar hesitated. Despite it all, Izuku didn't want to hurt Kaken. He could have knocked Kaken out, but head blows were dangerous even without taking one for all into account. Kaken hadn't needed more than that split second of indecision to create space between them. Instead of counterattacking though, he stood still, fist clenched. Deku a broken bar. Until this moment, Kaken hadn't looked genuinely angry. What the hell was that? Izuku flinched. He understood Kaken's fury. If their roles had been reversed, a broken bar. If Kaken had stopped just short of victory, a broken bar, it'd be humiliating. He didn't want Kaken to take pity on him, and he knew that Kaken felt the same way. I don't know, my body just a broken bar, reacted before I could think. As soon as the words left his mouth, he wanted to take them back. The last time something like that had happened was when Kaken had been captured by the slime villain, one of the boy's lowest moments. Damn it, Deku, I don't need you to pull your punches. Don't think that you can beat me without giving it your all. Just because I let you hold my hand doesn't mean that I'm going to go easy on you. Before Izuku could respond, Kaken ran forward. Izuku clenched his fists and prepared to dodge. He wouldn't disrespect Kaken again. He'd end this in one blow. When Kaken was about 3 meters away, he leapt into the air, grinding all of Izuku's careful plans to dust. What was Kaken thinking? He was too far away to jump unaided. He'd have to put his hands behind him to buy the time. Izuku realized what was happening. All he could do was brace himself with as much of One for All's power as he could handle. A controlled burst of flames erupted from Kaken's boots, propelling him forward probably at a pace even faster than Ida could manage. He grunted as Kaken slammed into him, pushing him back. Izuku had never experienced a blow so strong, but he turned all his focus to defense. He could do it. He had to do it. It was still jarring when he hit the wall. Kaken, genius that he was, disengaged his boots and created explosions in his hands an instant before impact. The blasts killed his own momentum while adding to Izuku's. The collision knocked the wind out of him. A broken bar, but Izuku was fine. He slumped down the wall and curled up while he tried to catch his breath. The shock of the blow plus his own shock at surviving unscathed made him tremble. Stupid, Izuku gasped. How could I forget your feet? I was the one who discovered it in the first place. My gauntlets collect sweat from my palms, and my boots collect sweat from my feet. I can use them to create incredibly powerful blasts. You did good, Deku. I wasn't going to use them because it's too dangerous, but you forced me to stop holding back. Still, you're just not on my level yet. Later, Izuku would look back on that yet and be flattered. Kaken was trying to say that he recognized Izuku's potential. In that moment, however, he was incredibly incensed. He got even more peeved when he looked up and saw the concern and guilt on Kaken's face. It was subtle, but Kaken couldn't hide anything from him. Izuku suddenly realized how he must look, hunched over and shaking. Kaken was worried about him, so much that he'd let his guard down completely, so much that he was blind to the lack of pain in Izuku's expression. It was kind of cowardly, taking advantage of that concern, but nothing pissed Izuku off more than when Kaken was a massive freaking hypocrite. Kaken, he wheezed, playing up his breathlessness. You were right. I shouldn't have underestimated you. I'm sorry. Kaken's gaze softened. It's fine, Deku. I get it, but you should have taken your own advice. Izuku roared as he sprang upwards and clocked Kaken right in the jaw. He didn't enhance his blow at all, but he was still really strong without One for All. Kaken reeled back from the force of it, stunned. He'd be down for at least a little while. Izuku sprinted full speed towards the room that Uraraka had mentioned. They didn't have much time left. When he got there, he saw Uraraka chasing Ida in an awkward game of cat and mouse. Before Ida could see him, Izuku started punching and kicking the columns around him, creating rubble and debris. Ito was faster than him, too, so joining in the chase wouldn't help. "Uraraka," he called when he busted up enough stone. "Switch with me, make all this float so that Ida can't run around as freely." If Ida was forced to maneuver around all the floating rubble, Izuku and Uraraka might be able to pin him down. Slowly but surely, Izuku's plan started to work. The two of them forced Ida into a corner, and Uraraka wrapped the capture tape around him. "We did it!" she cried, high-fiving Izuku. "Yeah," agreed Izuku, as he reached for the bomb. "Stop!" Kaken stood at the entrance of the room, panting. A nasty bruise was beginning to form on his cheek, and he had one hand extended towards them, his other holding a pin on his grenade gauntlet. "You've seen what this does from my feet, Deku. You know that my gauntlets will be 10 times stronger." "He did." Izuku gulped. Kaken's explosions had never leveled out between his hands and feet. If he'd been capable of such an impressive blast from the ladder of broken bar, the explosion from his gauntlets would be truly incredible. "You can't do that," cried Uraraka. "Your partner is in the way." Kaken just smirked. "You forget, round face. I'm playing the villain here." He let out a villainous-sounding laugh, before his grin grew even wider. "But sure, I don't want to kill you scrubs. That'd look bad on my record." There was a glint in Kaken's eye, and he shifted his aim slightly, so instead he was pointing at the bomb. "However, in this game, that's a nuclear bomb. If you don't surrender, I'll blow it up. But that would kill you too." Izuku blurted. "Maybe," Kaken allowed, "but it would definitely kill all innocent civilians in the city." "So what's it going to be, heroes? Are you going to try to win, even if it means risking millions of hypothetical lives?" Time was ticking down. Surely they had less than a minute left in the exercise. Izuku thought as fast as he could, but he couldn't see a path to victory for them. Uraraka clenched her fists. "No, we won't surrender." She ran towards the bomb, and Kaken's fingers twitched on the pin of his grenade gauntlet, but Izuku acted faster than either of them. Every Ida including Ida gaped at him in surprise when he wrapped the capture tape around Uraraka. "Deku!" she cried, dismayed. "I'm sorry," he gritted, glaring at the floor. "But Kaken's right. Even if we dodged, even if he didn't blow up the bomb this time, a broken bar, we're talking about fighting a guy who makes explosions, in a room with a nuclear bomb. It's guaranteed to go off eventually. There's no way this fight ends without the whole city going up in flames." Izuku raised his eyes and scowled at Kaken, who appeared to be just getting over his shock. "We surrender." There was a long silence, before All Might's voice sounded over the loudspeakers. In this round a broken bar victory goes to Team D." Uraraka huffed and ripped the capture tape off, stalking out of the door angrily. Ida had also removed his tape, and seemed unsure whether to congratulate his partner or scold him. "That was very unheroic, although, I suppose we were villains and I am very glad to win." "Thank you." "Buta broken bar, were you really willing to explode me?" Ida asked plaintively. Kaken barely glanced at him. "Fuck off, private school. I want to talk to Deku." Ida meeped and retreated, throwing an apologetic look over his shoulder at Izuku. Izuku couldn't even look at Kaken. He was furious at himself. He'd forgotten all about the capture tape until the very end. If he'd used it on Kaken instead of being self-righteous and punching the boy, then he and Uraraka would have won the challenge. Kaken must think that Izuku was a total idiot. Kaken's feet entered Izuku's field of vision. "Hey Deku," he called. Izuku looked up. There was a weird glint in Kaken's eyes that Izuku didn't recognize. "I'm pretty pissed. That rocket thrust was my second best move and you shook it off like it was nothing. I'm fucking furious that I had to use a dirty trick to beat you." Kaken smirked. "But, then again, you had to resort to tricks to beat me, so I guess we're even." Izuku finally understood what he was seeing. "We're even." He didn't just mean even a broken bar, he meant equal. The strange look in Kaken's eyes was respect. Izuku's bottom lip trembled, and his eyes watered. "K-Kak on a broken bar." Kaken blushed and reached out hesitantly, like he wasn't sure what to do. After a moment, he decided on ruffling Izuku's hair. "Jesus, Deku." It was hardly even a compliment. "Don't cry about it or anything." Izuku gulped and wiped at his eyes. "Alright, it's just Kaken. We studied a lot together in middle school. I know it made me do my best, and a broken bar it did for you too. Tellingly, Kakin didn't deny it. So, let's do that again now in high school. Let's get stronger together, so that the next time we face each other broken bar neither of us have to hold back. Amazingly, Kakin smiled at him, a real smile, not a smirk. I look forward to it. Deku. When they got back to home base, their classmates were waiting to congratulate them. Kirishima and Kaminari gushed over Kakin's performance, while Tsuyu pulled Izuku aside. That was amazing, Ribbit. I wouldn't have lasted 2 minutes against Bakugo and you beat him, kind of. Izuku chuckled and rubbed the back of his head. Ah, thanks, Tsuyu. I still lost though. Even so, interjected Ieyasu. Your logic was correct. Fighting with Bakugo in the same room as the bomb would have been inexcusably reckless. Any real hero would have made the same choice as you. Yeah, agreed Uraraka, who was looking sheepish. Ah, sorry for getting mad, Deku. I was so pumped up about the challenge. But Ierasu's right, it was reckless of me to keep fighting like that. If that had been real, and you hadn't stopped me, I would have gotten everyone killed. Oh, thanks Ierasu, thanks Uraraka, beamed Izuku. Plus, Kaminari called over from next to Kakin. You totally kicked Bakugo's ass. He didn't stand a chance against Tak. Say that to my face, you bastard, roared Kakin, who had a fistful of Kaminari's shirt. Midoriya's quirk is rather impressive, agreed Ieyasu, as if there weren't any commotion going on behind her. Students, cried All Might, shocking Kakin into dropping Kaminari. Such camaraderie. It's truly commendable. However, it's time to analyze Team A and Team D's challenge. The class proceeded to discuss their battle. Although much of the conversation was focused on Kakin and Izuku's individual spar, pretty much everyone was impressed at their fighting prowess. And now, began All Might, the time has come to award the title of Match MVP. For the first battle, the MVP is a broken bar Midoriya Izuku. His mouth fell open. What? But All Might, I lost. All Might grinned at him. Perhaps, and trust me, I strongly considered Bakugo for his brilliant bluff with the bomb. It wasn't a bluff, growled Kakin. But, continued All Might, in the end, I think you taught everyone here a valuable lesson, young Midoriya. All Might's expression sobered. Listen carefully, students. They shifted uneasily, recognizing that the mood had changed. You will find that there are times in a hero's career where the price of victory is higher than that of defeat. What if a villain was holding hostages, and you had to decide between letting the villain escape or saving the hostages' lives? All Might looked at them all gravely, meeting their eyes one by one. A true hero understands that victory is meaningless if it comes at the expense of innocent people. Sometimes you must be willing to sacrifice your pride. A broken bar you must be willing to lose for the greater good. So, for that reason, although he was on the losing team, the prize of MVP is Midoriya's. All Might. A broken bar. Izuku was openly sobbing, so much that Uraraka and Tsuyu inched away from him to keep themselves dry. IPR promise. I won't forget this. Excellent. Keep making me proud, my boy. Izuku sniffled, wiping at his eyes. Yes, sir. After the next group made their way to the arena, Uraraka got a sly look on her face. Oh, Deku, come over here. She pulled him into a hug, and pushed his head down to her shoulder. Uraraka stroked his hair. They'd never hugged before. It was pretty nice. There, Deku, you did great. Thanks, Uraraka, Izuku mumbled. Call me Okako. I'll call you dead fucking meat if you don't stop pawing at Deku. Izuku was suddenly pulled from Okako's arms. Before he really understood what was happening, Kakin had an arm wrapped around his shoulders and was scowling down at Okako. Rather than look upset, however, Uraraka grinned smugly like the canary that got the cream. Kakin realized that the whole thing was a ploy to make him jealous. At about the same time that Izuku did, but Izuku wrapped an arm around his waist before he could pull away. Izuku made a mental note to remember how sneaky Okako could be. Hey, thanks for, rescuing me, Kakin, Izuku teased. Kakin glowered mutinously, but his arm didn't leave Izuku's shoulders. Whatever, Deku, he muttered. As they settled in to watch the rest of the matches, Izuku couldn't help but smile to himself. Today he'd held Kakin's hand, earned his respect in battle, made All Might proud of him, and impressed a bunch of new friends from class. He was one step closer to achieving his dream. There was a knock at the door. Izuku bolted up from his seat at the kitchen table and waved at Mom to sit back down. "Ah, that's just Kaken, Mom. We're going out." He froze and stared at her like a deer caught in headlights. I don't mean going out, just like, going outside, as in, out there." Izuku pointed out their window, "but not like, out the window. That'd be silly." "Of course, me and Kaken could jump out the window and be just fine. We're training to be heroes and all, but that'd be against the rules about using quirks in public. Haha, we're just gonna walk down the stairs like completely normal friends do all the time, in a friendly way." Mom's eyebrows had been steadily raising throughout his mumble storm. She cocked her head at him. "So," Mom said carefully, "you and by Mom gotta go." Izuku flung the door open and slammed it shut behind him, panting like he'd just ran a marathon. In front of him, Kaken stood with his head bowed, and a hand over his eyes. "You, heard that then?" cringed Izuku. "Deku," sighed Kaken, "you are the least smooth person I've ever met. Never let anyone trust you with a secret." Luckily, before Izuku could sputter about any secrets he might be keeping, namely, the truth about his quirk, he was distracted by something in Kaken's other hand. "Hey, what's that?" Kaken actually blushed. "It's nothing." He kicked tidily at the ground. "Just something I found in my room. I was going to throw it out but I figured you might want it." Blinking, Izuku accepted the gift and his jaw fell open. "Kaken, this is your limited edition Battle of Tokyo All Might trading card. It's the most valuable card in your collection." Izuku had spent most of their childhood salivating over it, while Kaken bragged about it to all their friends. "I can't take this, it's too much." Kaken scoffed. "Come on, you seriously think I care about that thing even a tenth as much as you?" It was a good point. Kaken buried his hero trading cards in a desk drawer years ago, while Izuku still proudly displayed all his memorabilia. Alright Kaken," he beamed, "thanks for this. I'll treasure it forever." "Whatever Deku, it's just a stupid card." Despite his words, Kaken looked pleased that his gift was being so well received. "Let's go, your mom's probably listening at the door." "Go?" asked Izuku, scandalized. "I can't take this outside." "What if it got bent in my pocket? Or I dropped it in a puddle? What if I got a fingerprint on it?" Izuku was horrified at the thought. "I'll put it in my room." "Just a second." He burst back into the apartment and ran to his bedroom. Mom stood suspiciously close to the entrance, as if she had been eavesdropping and only had a moment to move out of the doorway. Vaguely, he was aware of Mom inviting Kaken inside. She'd been unsure of Kaken at first, but after years passed and they remained friends, she'd warmed up to him. Izuku frowned at his room. He'd have to decide on the perfect spot for the card later, but for now he placed it carefully on the center of his desk, apologetically shifting an All Might action figure to the side. When Izuku returned to the kitchen, Kaken looked kind of harried while Mom was asking him increasingly probing questions. "Thanks Mom, we'll be out of your hair now," said Izuku desperately. He grabbed Kaken's hand to pull him outside, but realized that he'd made a mistake when Mom's eyes locked onto their clasped hands like a heat-seeking missile. Izuku blushed red to the roots of his hair. Rather than open his mouth and embarrass himself further, Izuku pulled a very willing Kaken from the apartment. Once they got downstairs, Kaken took the lead and Izuku blushed for an entirely different reason. Holding hands was still new, and it sent a thrill through Izuku every time. "Ah, Kaken, where are we going?" "Ice cream place down by the arcade." That was one of Izuku's favorite places. He grinned. "Great idea, Kaken." He continued to chatter at Kaken while they walked hand in hand to the ice cream shop. Once they arrived, Kaken told him to grab a table, and got in line to buy their treats. Izuku worried his lip while he waited. His favorite flavor was strawberry and Kaken always teased him for it. Kaken thought that chocolate was the far superior choice, and whenever it was his turn to buy ice cream he'd get them both chocolate. Despite Izuku's protests, he'd resign himself to a strawberry-less afternoon until Kaken came back. "You got me strawberry," beamed Izuku. "Duh," scoffed Kaken, "it's your favorite." "I don't know why though, chocolate is way better." While they debated about the merits of chocolate and strawberry, Kaken sat down next to him. He was holding his kon in his left hand, and Izuku had his own in his right. That left them free to fit their empty hands together. Izuku's pulse quickened, and it sped up even more when Kaken knocked their knees together under the table, after a couple of times making contact. Eventually the two of them just sort of, left them pressed up against each other. Izuku had never been so conscious of his freaking knee before, but with Kaken's touching it, he felt tingly all down his leg. The two of them chattered about class and about their upcoming rescue trials. Well, Izuku chattered and Kaken nodded and grunted in the appropriate spots. And I wonder what hero will be in charge of it, mused Izuku. Or if, Izuku's brain short-circuited when Kaken casually reached over with a napkin and wiped at the corner of Izuku's mouth. Kaken grinned cockily. Sorry, you had a spot. It took Izuku's breath away. Kaken was so broken bar beautiful, was the only word for it, especially when he smiled so confidently like that. Izuku had always known that Kaken was beautiful. Even before he understood what it meant, Izuku liked looking his friend. But back then he had to be careful not to stare too much, or allow his face to reflect his thoughts. Now, though, Izuku thought that maybe it would be okay. Recalling how effortlessly Kaken reached over and touched his face made Izuku want to be brave, too. Before he could talk himself out of it, he leaned over and pressed his lips gently against Kaken's cheek. Thanks for today, Kaken. I've had a lot of fun. Kaken's mouth opened slightly in shock, and a slight pink tinge dusted his cheeks. Thanks, I mean you're welcome. Izuku perked up, unable to contain his joy. I made Kaken speechless? He asked gleefully. The blonde's expression turned mulish, though the blush remained fixed to his face. Let's see how well you handle it then, Deku. Before he could properly process that statement, Kaken leaned over and pecked Izuku's cheek. All the blood in his body rushed to his face. But you? Really? I didn't. Kaken grinned smugly. See? He ducked his head and beamed opally down at the table. Izuku couldn't help but squeeze Kaken's hand. This was easily the second best day of his life, right after the one where All Might told him that he could be a hero. Hey Deku? He glanced up at Kaken shyly. I still think that strawberry ice cream is shit though. It wasn't even that funny. But Izuku couldn't contain his laughter. He felt like a pot that was boiling over, except instead of water he was filled with happiness. In that moment, Izuku felt like he could do